Looks like you're ready. Going live. Okay. I am now here. Hopefully you guys are also. I just had a comment. So I apologize for any delay. YouTube was being quite stupid. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to talk about using JavaScript libraries and how we can use JavaScript libraries in our code. Much like the examples in class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using the moment library, and then later we'll get into the Plotly library because those are two really important ones. So just to start, you can see I've created a replet just to save myself some typing. A REPL. Now remember that for today, and actually the last time will be today, we are going to be using a HTML CSS replet. Normally we will not be doing that. We'll talk about actually creating servers and things on Monday. But for today, I have the HTML CSS replet. You'll also note that in this REPL, I have a number of different files. The reason why I have all of these different files is simply that I'm frankly trying to save myself a little bit of time. The one file that is the most important if you're doing this is that index.html file. That is the file that by default the system is going to rely on. That's the one it's going to display. So here what I have is I have my HTML file. Again, like every other HTML file, begins with that HTML element, ends with the /HTML. And then every HTML file has exactly one head and one body, no more, no less. So I've got my head region. And in my head region, I'm going to, for this first example, load in the moment.js library. Typically for JavaScript libraries, we load them in the head. And the reason we do that is once we load in a JavaScript library, once we have this script tag, that's going to make that code available through the rest, anything else that we do in this HTML file. Since libraries tend not to do anything on their own, instead what a library is just simply a collection of functions. So we could actually look at this file, copy the URL, go to a new tab, show you the new tab. And what you can see right here is this is actually what is going to get loaded in. And you'll see it's just literally a collection of JavaScript functions. These functions are no different than what you could write or I could write. It's just generally the same sort of idea. So once we load in this script, now we've got the ability to use any of those functions. So for the actual page itself, I'm going to create a header one just saying second web page. That seems reasonable. And then a paragraph here. I gave it the ID date time because I'm going to display the date/time in there. That's what the moment library does. And then now right here, after that, I have a script tag saying source equals mymoment.js for JavaScript files that we write on our own, JavaScript files that have code that we want to execute. We usually put it at the end of the body. Remember that the way that when we download a HTML file, when we tell our browser, go visit this page, the way it works is it downloads that HTML file, and then it starts working through it in order. As soon as it sees a script tag, it immediately stops its rendering, stops drawing what's on the page, and instead it goes and downloads that file and goes through any functions, makes them available, and if there's just code not in a function, it'll execute that. So since we want our code that we write ourselves to be able to work with any of the elements beforehand, we tend to put script tags of our own at the end of the body. Yes, this is about day 24. So given that we are doing that, you can see here is the JavaScript file I have. And what I've done is I'm using the fancier version of our of the function. So what I've got is I've got a function. I named it display time. It's going to get that date time element. Remember that in the code here, I have a paragraph. I named it date time. That ID is date time. So the way that we get that in JavaScript, the way we get an object equivalent to that is by using document.getElement by ID. And then we pass in the ID that we have. Here I wanted the date time element, so I use the string date time. I assign that to my variable elem. Then what I can do is, since that is a paragraph, it's not an input, I have to use inner HTML, and I say to set the inner HTML to, call that moment function. That's how moment.js starts. And then I want to format it with the year, the hour, the month, and the second. Now, that's a function. That's useful. But of course, that won't make a difference. That won't actually execute something, right? So if I just had that code, I'll comment out this one line, and I run this, what you'll see is it just loads up the second web page and doesn't do anything else. I'm actually going to, and one thing I recommend for all of you, when you're running any of these files, always open up the page in a new tab. It just makes it a lot easier to be able to understand and view later on. So right now it doesn't do anything, but if I want, I can uncomment that out, this set interval call. What this set interval call does, this is a built-in function to JavaScript. It takes two arguments. The first argument should be the name of a function, and this is the function that it will call on its own. So we're telling JavaScript every so often, every interval, please call this function. So I want it to call display time. And then we have to give it how often it should call that function. And so what I said is I want that function called every 1,000 milliseconds, or because I was doing this, this means that this function will be called at a rate of 1 hertz. And so every 1,000 milliseconds, it will call and execute display time. Now you don't see a function call here for display time because JavaScript's going to take care of it for us. Actually, a little bit of foreshadowing of something you're going to be doing next week or in a little bit. So if we have this, so now I've had this, I'm going to go back to my main page and I'm going to reload it. And you can see the very exciting little bit of time that's going on here. So what's going to happen, right? This clock is just constantly updating every second because I told it to be called every second. Now, I accept that this is not the most exciting thing in the world. This isn't the greatest. One thing you'll note is that there's a little bit of a delay before we started. So we could go in and fix that, right? If I wanted to, I could add a second function. So it calls display time immediately. And then what will happen is now when I reload this page, you can see it starts up immediately and goes from there. So this is not, I realize again, the most exciting thing ever. If we wanted to do other sorts of things, maybe we want more than just the year and the time at the moment, what I happen to have open is the moment.js homepage. And if you look there, it's going to tell you exactly all the different ways, all the different sort of formats that you can use, different ways of formatting it, different ways of creating dates, doing relative dates, all sorts of different things that are options. And part of how I knew how to do this, part of how you have to learn how to do this, part of what it means to be a programmer, honestly, is reading documentation like this. So The moment library itself isn't very important. You don't have to worry about it. This is pretty much the last time you're actually going to see it. The reason we use it is just because it's relatively simple, and hopefully this is a good just introduction to get you to understand how this all works. Any questions right now about what is going on? Any questions about how we can do this basic sort of work with JavaScript libraries? Get rid of this. I don't care about it. Okay, it seems like there's not much of there's no questions right now. So what I want to do is get into a much more interesting and actually much more important JavaScript library that we'll be using, and that is that Plotly library. So again, this is just some code. This is in the plots.html file, but to be perfectly honest, remember that in order for this to work, we need to have it in index.html this is a replit thing because we have an HTML replit. So I'm just going to copy and paste the code into there. And you can see again, the format of this process is very similar. I've got that script statement in the header that loads in the Plotly library. Then I've got in my body, again, every HTML file, one header, one body, one head, one body. I'm going to have a header 1 saying third plot page. Now I'm going to use a region, just a divider area for named my plot, and the script I'm going to use is named plots.js. That's what I named my JavaScript file. Could name it anything. That's what I thought of. So this JavaScript file, what it's going to do is it's going to, and this is actually from the lecture videos, if you look, I'm going to create a data set. And the way that we create a data set, and again, the way you have to learn about this is, here's the Plotly library. You can see there's lots of documentation for it. I had to read through the documentation. There's no other way of going about it. If you look, they have how to get started. Is Plotly free? Plotly is a free and open source project. As it happens, make sure you're following the license. Go from there. So when you read the documentation, you learn that the way that Plotly wants data is you need to give it an array. So I have data being an array. And that array needs to have one object per thing you want graphed if you want to make a simple line plot, a simple line graph, which is what I want. So that one object has to have two different keys. It needs to have X and Y. These are the X values. These are the Y values. And they have to have the same length, right? So this is saying that 1930, we want to plot this. 1940, this, 50, and 1960. Then we can have a layout, and that's just a good way to give the graph a title, to give it an X-axis title and a Y-axis title. And then finally, and the big thing that we have to do is we have to call plotly.newplot. And then what I've done is I've given it the name of the element where I want it to display the plot. So that is my plot, right? So right here, you can see it's capital my plot. Here, it's going to be lowercase because I wanted to see what would happen. Then the data that we want to plot and what the layout should be. And so now, if I go back to my page and reload it, you can see it says third plot page, but nothing appears. This is not uncommon, and if you remember, I sort of alluded to why, but this is where this web developer menu can be very, very helpful. I'm going to turn it on. One thing you can see is the console, and when we switch over to the console, you can see it's giving me an error. Again, the thing to remember, and this is going to become very important, and this can be kind of tricky, remember that all of the code, all the Plotly code, the rendering is being done by my computer. So I need to look at the console for my computer. And part of why it's always useful to split out the page as its own tab is because there's lots of stuff going on in Replit. I don't care about that in terms of debugging my code. Having the console open allows me to just see that. So it's saying, nope, there's no element with my plot. And of course, the problem is that I used a capital P here in the HTML file, but a lowercase p here in JavaScript. That doesn't work. So I'm going to make that a capital. And now when I run it, go back, rerun it, you can see it displays the buffalo population and has that graph. And that's really, really big, so I'm going to shrink it down a little bit. So I realize this is not the most exciting thing for all of you, but it's there, it works. So any questions about this so far? Okay, I don't see any questions. So what I want to do is just go over a couple of different things, a couple of different common mistakes, errors people make. So the first thing is, remember that this is going to, whenever we have a script tag, whenever the browser encounters a script tag in our code, it immediately stops what it's doing and executes that JavaScript. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to boost that script tag now above where our divider is. And so when I do that, what's going to happen is note that it gives me an error. And the reason why is when it executes my JavaScript code, right, we tell it to plot in my plot. But at that point in time, we have not yet created that div. We haven't created something yet with that ID myplot. And so as a result, it can't display anything and it gives me this error saying that that ID does not exist. So that's obviously not good. And this is why we typically have our own scripts, the script tags to load in our code at the bottom of the body. It means that we know everything has been created, all of those HTML elements are there, and so we can use them however we want. So another thing we can do, I'm going to steal some data here. We'll get to this whole code later, is suppose I wanted to plot out two things. So there are two different ways I could go about this. One way I could go about this is by plotting both graphs in the same thing. So I'm going to have two different lines in the same thing. So I have the Buffalo population. I also want the Rochester population. Change my title just to be more clear. And again, if you go and read through the Plotly standards, one of the things you'll see is that if you want to show two different lines, that's perfectly legal. What you have to do then is create in my data array, have two entries, one object per entry. So now this has been saved over. If I run this code, you can see that we have the two graphs. We've got our Buffalo population and our Rochester population. And you'll also note that now it's putting up a legend since I have two different things. And so we can see what's going on. So this works pretty well, right? We can sort of see the two things. But now one thing is, this is I was going to say, for any of you who do any sort of business work or science work or whatever else, this is a common hack to make things look a lot bigger or more different than they are, right? When we're talking about populations by definition should start at 0. We want to show the actual scale. So in order to do that, what we'd have to do is go through the documentation and figure out how to do that. And that's, frankly, you would have to go through function reference and some of the examples. That's a lot of work. I did that ahead of time. And so what you'll learn is that there is an option we can use for the layout. Copy that over. And in my layout, and for the y-axis object, I can also create this key range and say it's between 0 and 600,000. And what this is doing is this is telling Plotly, when we call Plotly, that the y-axis should be put on a scale from 0 to 600,000. So you can see here now that those differences don't look as impressive, but it's probably a little bit more honest of how this is going to work. So a couple other things that we can do with this library. One thing is right now I'm using the string myplot as a way of telling it where to plot. And that is certainly one option. Another thing that we could do is we could pass in a variable. We could actually pass in the object where we want it to be there. So in order to do that, we'll need to declare a variable. And so I'm going to say the div object equals document dot get element by ID and myplot. And now what I'll do is rather than passing in this string myplot, if you read the documentation, one of the things it says is you can pass in the object. Now, here's the thing. This should be an error, right? And the reason it's an error, seeing if any of you point this out. No. The reason this is an error is that note I have not put a let statement here. And for this file, I said use strict. So let's see what happens. Let's reload this code. And you can see that again, because we have that use strict, it's actually going to give me an error. Now, this is one of the benefits. This is actually this is an easy way to make bad code. So I'll put that let back in, just showing that that works. It's a good way of making sure you get the right thing. And you can see that the code still works. It works the same way as it did before. We don't have to just use the string. If we wanted, we can actually pass in an object reference. So one last thing I want to show that will also be useful is right now we have this one graph that shows the two things. And probably if we were doing this in real life, this is what we'd want to do. However, sometimes we want to show multiple graphs on a page. And in order to do that, what we need to do is just call plotly.newplot more than one time. So I'm going to rename this to Buffalo Data. And I'm going to make this Buffalo layout. And then I'm going to create another set of, and we'll plot that out here. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Copy it down. But I'm going to make the Rochester data. Get this correct. And have it, I'm going to try to plot out this second piece of data, but note that one of the things I am not doing is I'm still using the same location. I'm still trying to put it in that same area of the HTML page. So when we do this, what's going to happen? Note that it only shows the population of Rochester. We can only display one graph in a region at a time. In fact, if I were to put some text in here, go back up to this. Suppose that I have some text in there. Wait for it to save. Note that it really messes everything up because it's going to try to use that same space, that's already created to do that. So we really need to have an empty region and then realize we can only show one graph there. So if we want to have these two graphs, that makes sense. What we would want to do is create two different spaces. So I'm going to create a buff plot region, and I'll create a Rochester plot region, a rock plot region. Then what I'm going to do is go into my code, and now, you said underscore, no I did not. Make sure I got it right. I'm going to do a buff plot and say that's where the Buffalo data should go. And for this one, I'll just use the string and have it go in rock plot. And now when I run this, go back to my web page and run this. I forgot to get rid of the population of Rochester. Hold on, just to make it look nice. You can see we have both sets of graphs. This is something that you're actually going to end up needing for the project, so I wanted to show that to you. Any questions about how this works? Any questions about how we can use Plotly to plot things? Now, for the project itself, you're actually going to need to do several different types of plot out several different types of graphs. And for this, and this is one of the goals of this project, is to get you to start to read some of the documentation. So there are other types of graphs you will need to plot for the project. And if you look in the Plotly documentation, plotly.com/JavaScript, it has all of the different types of graphs you're going to need. There is documentation, there are examples. It's relatively straightforward, but we do want you to have to go through and just look at it. So that's why you're going to have to find that out. So the one last thing I want to show you, and this is not so much about today's material, but just a little bit of foreshadowing for what we're going to be talking about on Monday, is the fact that when we're working in this system, because all of this code is on my computer, right? It's on the computer that I have. It's not on, the files are on Replit, but my computer downloads them and displays them, runs them. This also means I can make changes. So if I want, I can change that header to now say 4th plot page. And of course, that's what you see. I just went into my inspector and changed it, because now when I made that change in the version of the file that my computer has, right? If we go back and look at what's on Replit, nothing has changed. The server itself hasn't changed. If and when in a second I reload this page, you can see that that change goes away. It's just something I'm changing on my computer, on my end. Similarly, I can actually run any sort of code I want here. If I want, I can, in the console, I can actually type commands. Create a variable named, I hate coming up with variable names, so we'll go with that. So I'm going to get the element where we have the buffalo plot. And I'm going to overwrite what's there, change that inner HTML key to be hacked by me. And when I do this, note that that graph goes away. I can change that, what that says, just by running JavaScript right here in the console. There's nothing that anybody can do to stop me, but at the same time, this is only in the version of the file that's currently on my computer, right? Our HTML file on Replit has stayed the same, and our JavaScript file on Replit has stayed the same. So this is kind of a problem and kind of not. It means that anytime we're making any of these sort of web apps, we have to respect the fact that the user, that someone who's looking at this code, can make whatever changes they want. Having said that, we also have the ability, whenever we want, they can't actually make changes to our server, to anything that really matters on the server. So when we start thinking about real web apps and how we're going to make it really work, we need to think about how we're going to sort of protect our code, make sure that everything is possible by doing changes on the server side, right? So UB Infinite, you can make all sorts of changes you want to the web page on your computer. Obviously, as an instructor, I want you to actually do the assignment. I don't want you just to change the stars and have it work that way. So starting on Monday, day 25, we'll look at how we can do that, how we can write real web apps. So that's all I have for today. Do you guys have any questions, anything you want me to go over again? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. I think that's probably about the delay. So given that, thank you all very much. Hopefully you have a good weekend. Make sure you stay safe. Make sure you stay healthy. Remember, we're all in this together. And just as important, make sure you have a little bit of fun this weekend. Thank you all. If you have questions, there still are going to be, I have office hours at 4. I think TAs have office hours today. And I will see you, talk to you, interact with you potentially on Monday.